One of the things that I love about Next Church gatherings is the opportunity to learn from talented, visionary, heart-filled people who live in the places where our gatherings are held. So as one of the locals here, I was really excited when Sheri Parks and Betsy Nix said yes to our invitation to present today. Sheri Parks is the Associate Dean for Research, Interdisciplinary Scholarship, and Programming for the College of Arts and Humanities, and an Associate Professor for American Studies at the University of Maryland. Her research focuses on public aesthetics and the ways in which people find and create meaning and beauty in their everyday lives, with specific emphasis on race, gender, and social class. She also studies public mythology and its effect upon individuals, families, and minority cultures. If you lived in Baltimore and I asked you, do you know Sheri Parks? Likely you would say, yes, I hear her on the radio all the time. She's the voice of wisdom and the voice of conscience. She challenges our thinking. She makes us grow. Dr. Parks comes from a family of Presbyterians. In fact, for the Davidson College folks in the house, her brother James was one of the first black students to integrate Davidson College. And I saw James Parks, there he is, right here, who served as our moderator recently. Dr. Sheri Parks is the author of Fierce Angels, The Strong Black Woman in American Life and Culture. Betsy Nix is the Associate Professor of History and the Chair of the Division of Legal, Ethical, and Historical Studies at the University of Baltimore. She's one of the project organizers of the anthology entitled Baltimore 68, Riots and Rebirth in an American City. You can read about her other publications and speaking engagements on the Yap if you have that. She's been a member of the church that I serve for 18 years. She has served as elder, trustee, and I like to say chair of the worship committee, which I usually like to call the customer complaint department. So she's tough. More than once I've been driving through West Baltimore only to see Betsy walking across our geographical, racial, and class divides, teaching one of her classes on the history of how we got to live where we live by race, class, and income from the street. What's interesting, I think, and delightful today is that Betsy and Sheri have never worked together before this moment. And perhaps what will tell you the most about them is when I asked them if they'd be willing to do this together, they both said, we'd be delighted to do it. They are that collaborative. So please help me in welcoming Drs. Sheri Parks and Betsy Nix.
Thank you, Andrew. And yes, in this room, the most important credential is that I'm James Parks' sister. So I'm glad you made that clear so that people went, they kind of look alike, but so. And I also want to thank Next Church and all of you for introducing us, because we knew of each other. We call this Baltimore, so we kind of hear about each other. But what you're going to hear today really is an ongoing conversation. We've had several, and it will continue. So thank you for giving me a comrade in arms. So we're going to start by giving you some of your words back to you. We eventually dwell in that harsh and empty place where the line between life and death grows thin. However, improbably, Scripture says that that is precisely the place where God's promises begin to bloom. It is interesting that you come to Baltimore because, of course, Baltimore has been in the news for a long time because it is a post-industrial American city, and it has become the metaphor for the post-industrial American city. And the images that generally are brought into mind with that is death. And I was thinking during the service that many of you are thinking about death and walking with death all through this conference, and that is the life of a working class black person in Baltimore. It is always around them. It is always there. And yet, there is persistence and resilience like you may never have imagined. One of the reasons that Andrew asked me, and I always wonder when you you give that kind of introduction, it's like, okay, I got to live up to that. Is that out of the uprising that came about here because of the death of Freddie Gray and the conditions that gave rise to that, was a project called Baltimore Stories. I have to say, it was funded by the National Endowment for the Humanities. We staged 20 events around working class Black Baltimore, gathering stories and giving rise to stories. And that is what's particularly important, is that while we were thinking about the idea of the desert, that the desert is not dead. And those of you who live near deserts or have visited them, when it rains, you know that as soon as the conditions arise, that it does what? It blooms. So it is not dead, and that idea of rebirth is actually always with us. So first, let's contemplate the nature of the desert. We're both professors, so yeah, we're going to get a little teacherly on you. But we have video clips to kind of chop it up. During Baltimore Stories, we went around and helped people have voice and thought about the nature of the stories in the city and brought together. One of the aims was to bring up stories that were not part of, and we used the word with all of the importance of the master narrative in Baltimore and about Baltimore. And we came to talk often about the brilliance in the street. And so the first clip I'm going to show you is a young man who was in the 9th grade at the time, and he says, "This is hell." But then you'll notice that the slightly older young Black man addresses him. So let's listen to that clip and then talk about it a bit.
Every resident who was a part of the Baltimore Stories felt as though they were involved. They were not told to be quiet during discussion. It was open discussion, and they all felt heard. They all felt a sense of empathy that wasn't really felt before.
For instance, a moment when we were talking to high schoolers from Coppin State Academy, and there's a young man who was a first-year student at the time, and this young man says, "Baltimore's hell. This is hell. This is where hell is." And he started talking about being worried about being shot at any moment.
Like, it's how the Baltimore is like killed or be killed, because you got to worry about more than just police officers. You could walk down the street and you make a mistake and bump into somebody and they just blow your brains out for no reason. So the way I feel like, the way certain people feel like in Baltimore, they don't want to go to cop and talk to them, they want to leave here because they feel like here is where hell is. This is where hell is. It's real. When you walk outside, trust and believe. I got people who on my block living with BGF and all that. You get smart with them, you will get killed. That's how it is out here. I got uncles in jail. My uncle just passed away because the police thought he had a weapon, but he had an inhaler, and they shot him. So the way I feel about it is, I want to be a lawyer, a criminal defense lawyer, but the way I feel like is, I want to leave here. I hate Baltimore. I really do hate Baltimore. That's why I want to leave here. I don't like it.
They need you here, bro. Like, if you leave here, who else is advocating for these people? You know what I'm saying? Like, and I hate to keep going, but it's just the reality of it all, right? We have this thing where people are getting these degrees and being educated in Baltimore, and they leave. And they take those resources and everything that they gain from the city, and they go elsewhere, and the city remains the same. You got people that lived in Baltimore 30, 40 years ago, and they come back to Baltimore, and they be like, you know what? The city is still the same. Ain't nothing changed. And that's because people have that same kind of thinking. I'm not saying don't leave Baltimore and gain experience and gain those opportunities. What I am saying is you got family members that live here. You got people that you know that are friends that are invested in these communities. And it is our due diligence as Black men to come back and revitalize these communities.
And yeah, please applaud. And I want to reassure you that we have not left that young man. That we've circled back, and there's a new project that's going on at Coppin State and Coppin Academy that's directed at him and his friends around to help them document, to use 360 cameras to document the joy and the pain in the day of the life. And then so Coppin State students will learn how to be project managers, and then we'll work with Coppin Academy high school students so that they all learn. And then there's an internship for the students. And he has shown up in a couple of projects in terms of he's become the muse of a lot of projects. So you've read the headlines. You probably read them before you got on the plane to come here. USA Today says that Baltimore is the most dangerous city in the United States. And now we find out that, and you're going to probably talk more about this, that the police are maybe not the remedy that many people thought they would be, because there's a certain segment that is particularly corrupt. That's a story that working class black people have been saying for a while now. It has come to light. And yet, and we're going to keep coming back to that, and yet, every time you hear a story of death, every time you hear a story of sadness, and this is something that happens in the black church, is that there's always the refrain at the end that it comes back up and joy comes in the morning. And so that is something that is really important to understand about Baltimore and about working with people who live with death every day, is that they live with death every day.
So if you were preparing to come here and you saw that Baltimore had been designated by USA Today as the most dangerous city in America, those statistics are based on 2017 murder rates, robbery rates, shooting rates. And 2017 marked a high point or a low point in all of those violent activities. And it comes from the unrest, the uprising of 2015. And after 2015, pharmacies were looted, and we were told that people are shooting each other on the streets more because there are many more drugs on the streets, and people are fighting over turf wars. I live about a mile west of here. I live a mile west of Martin Luther King Boulevard. And for a lot of times, you can walk through open-air drug markets in my neighborhood, and I do that all the time, but something changed after 2016, 2017. You could no longer walk around on Sunday afternoons and feel like there wasn't going to be a shooting. Shootings started on Sunday afternoons. Shootings happened in front of schools with children in the playground. Something was very, very different after the uprising. Well, in the last few months, we've come to find out that people were looting the pharmacies in Baltimore City. They were taking the drugs and selling them to police officers who were selling them to drug dealers, who were selling them at a profit to drug dealers, and then all of those drugs were flooding our streets. That is testimony in court, sworn testimony as to what was actually happening. So just as Sheri said, we had been told for years these stories about corrupt cops on the streets of Baltimore. This is the gun task force. They're testifying that this practice has gone back 16 years, at least. That's just the people who are on trial now. And so these stories that people have been saying, this cop is corrupt, cop is corrupt, you're saying, oh, you're overblowing that. No, you have to listen to those stories. That's the truth. That is the truth of life here in our city. And what happens to trust? What happens to the social fabric when you can't trust the people who are paid to protect you? So the work that Sheri and I both do is based on, as you said, as one of the testimonies this morning said, showing up and shutting up. So we show up and we ask people questions about their lives or about their understanding of their city or their history of their city or mythologies of their city, and they tell us. And we put together all of those different points of view and create a mosaic of understanding of what the story of our city is. So after 2015, the uprising, people started coming to us because we had done this project on Baltimore 68. And in that, my students had interviewed 70 different people around the city who had experienced the unrest of 68, the uprisings that followed the assassination of the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. And we had talked to them about what their life was like before 68, during the unrest, and then after 68. And I just want you to know, our publisher said we had to have the word riot in the title of our book. And we really would have liked to have another word like uprising, and that's 2015. It's been called the uprising. But then we really said, you can't understand 2015 without understanding Baltimore 68. And you can't understand 68 until you go through the history of structural racism that has been in place in our city for so many decades. Our city in 1910 created the first law that said that there were going to be certain blocks in Baltimore that were black blocks and certain blocks that were in Baltimore that were white blocks. And if you wanted to move on to that block, you had to determine the percentage of people on that block that were white or black. And you couldn't change the percentage. You couldn't change that balance. And other cities followed our example. They didn't look at that and say, that is ridiculous. They said, oh, that's a great idea. So like Louisville, St. Louis, other places like that, put into practice that same pattern of segregation, and those are the same patterns that we see today. Segregated neighborhoods, disinvestment, economic disinvestment that still plague our cities. And even if students don't know that history, even if young people don't know it, they feel it, and they feel it every day that they live in a neglected neighborhood that doesn't have the same resources that other neighborhoods in our city do.
And I don't know if you knew this when you planned to come to Baltimore. Baltimore is also the place where organized charity began. It is the first place where wealthy white women said, we should help these people and we should organize in such a way, and because we're helping them, we should be able to go into their homes and tell them what to do. So that happens everywhere, but the first place where it was actually organized, programmatic, and structural was here. And so we have a long history of having ideas that don't make a lot of sense, that don't work. One of the things that we did in Baltimore Stories, in 68, in the older civil rights movement, we know now that women and girls were not allowed to speak. Dorothy Height said at the end of her life that, she had a speech prepared for the March on Washington, and she was told, she didn't say who, so we don't know if it was Martin Luther King, but she was told that women would not be allowed to speak. She kept that secret until close to her death, and said that much. And that was one of the things that was different about the uprising. And we use the word uprising because the community came together and had a conversation and decided that that was what they were going to talk about. It's important that you know that there was rioting. That was only 2 days. It had been preceded and followed by weeks and weeks of organized, by-the-book, non-violent protests. And so we don't honor by saying the riots because most of it was not. Different people, different project, really. So we invited some of the women, and during the uprising, women and girls spoke. And so we invited some of the women and girls who spoke during the uprising to speak again about what they were doing. And one of them is Shamika. And so the sound isn't great, so I need to tell you what she's saying, because what she's helping us to introduce to you is, what does it have to do with you? What does this have to do with good people of faith? And one of the things she talks about being able to, I asked, what happens when women and girls enter the public discourse? And she said, and you'll hear her say this, we can go up to the police and whisper in their ears. So to set the stage, you'll see some of this. You're talking about flanks of police with mounted police behind them for most of the part. And we had already seen a moment where there was a young black man who was taunting them by just walking in front of them. And they had let that go on for a bit, and then they swallowed him. They just came around and pushed him to the back, and we never saw him again. He was arrested. The moment she describes is after that. And one of the words that she says is that we never know what the spirit is. So she specifically uses the word spirit. And we discovered a story that hadn't been covered by the media, that there was this whole level of empathy and love, even toward the police, that wasn't part of the national narrative about Baltimore. But I'll let Shamika tell you. And she's smudging the police. She's purifying them with white sage. So we knew we wanted to pull out the voices of women and girls who were silenced during the 1968 activism. We know, for instance, that Dorothy Height arrived at the March on Washington prepared to speak and was told that she could not. This time around, women and girls spoke. And so we knew we had these themes that we wanted to go to. There were some big ideas. But once you're in a room with the community, that doesn't mean that they necessarily say what you think they're going to say.
We were talking to the police, like our people. Spirit is a lot of things, right? They really need to, like, too much detail about a lot of stuff happens in the front line. And we said, we are safer than you are. I'm to them like we are femininity and balance and beauty and healing and wholeness. So I can walk up to a policeman on the front line and whisper in his ear, right? You know what I'm saying? Get really and burn sage like right in their faces and say bless you.
So yes, we are academics, and that's not something to be ashamed of. But that is a tool, particularly if you're at a large public land-grant university, like the University of Maryland. We and other people around the country who are doing similar work is to take the deep dive of the academy, because we often do have the time and the tools to have a deeper, closer look, but then to take that out into the community and to partner with the community. Okay. So what happened when she went up and whispered in the policeman's ear? He's standing and he's in formation, and she walks up to him and says, "Why do you look so mean? Why do you look so mean?" In case you didn't hear me in the back. And he's still in formation. He says, "I have been standing here for 7 hours, and I have to go." He's whispering too. "I have to go to the bathroom, and I'm hungry." And so if you were watching closely, you might have noticed that there was a time where suddenly pizza was delivered to the police. That was because Shamika and her comrades walked over to, they were smart. They walked over to the media, because there was always media, and said, "Do you know they haven't had any dinner? Do you know they haven't eaten in a while?" And the media reported that the police hadn't eaten in a while, and then of course that creates a media event, and they because I remember looking at that saying, is that the best way to feed you? But that's what they could get. We don't even want to think about what would have happened that evening if they had been that uncomfortable for much longer. So we honor them for thwarting what might have happened. Now, but notice, she loved the policeman, which is hard to do in many situations. But she had the wherewithal to walk up and say, what's going on with you? And he responded, and it worked. Now, I showed you the little tell-in about what a university could do, and you were probably thinking, well, did she, tell the guy in the back not to cut it off? We left that there because as we were talking, and we're college professors, that what I said about academics, about having the leisure and the tools and the deep dive, is also true of Presbyterian congregations.
So if you think about ways that your congregation and you personally can help reweave the social fabric, you can build trust among constituencies that maybe have a history of having very little trust. That is a role that we can take, because we have ability to understand the history, ability to interpret the texts or stories of all kinds of people, and we also have connections and networks that can really bring people together and open up doors for other folks. I wanted to tell you about a secular organization here in Baltimore, because I do, like Sheri, I want to celebrate the students who were out in the streets well before the uprising, well before Freddie Gray's funeral. Those students, high school students mostly, were closing down I-83 to protest Ferguson. They were very active about the life beyond Baltimore City, but also seeing how those national issues connected to them. And so all of that was happening. You see the students from Florida who are protesting gun safety and the lack of gun safety. Well, people in Baltimore, young people in Baltimore City public schools and private schools, they were doing that same thing too. And so they're those students, but they're also students who can fall through the cracks. And there's an organization here called Thread, and their motto is Reweaving the Social Fabric. And they identify students in 3 Baltimore public schools who are in the lower 25 percentile of their class. And if they can identify an obstacle that those students are having, they will put them into a program where they say, for the next 10 years, you will have a group of 5 people that we'll call your family, 5 volunteers who are not going to take you to the symphony and not going to try to turn you into somebody that you aren't, but they are going to listen to you and see what you need. If you need a ride to the dentist, they're going to take you to the dentist. If you need to find a dentist, they're going to find a dentist. And so a lot of those students are at Hopkins. The program was started by a Hopkins grad, but it's expanding. And it's gone from, it has a track record now. It's 14 years old. It's taken people through high school, through college. The chance that those students were going to graduate from high school before Thread was 7%, and now 87% of the students in Thread graduate from high school. And some of the students who went through Thread are getting jobs on the Thread staff as mentors to help new students come through. So that's a secular model, but we can incorporate that into our churches too. It's almost like church is built to do that, right? And so if a student is looking for somebody other than their family, not replacing their family, but sometimes teenagers want to talk to people who aren't their parents. So churches can establish that. And also, think about it on the other end. What about people who aren't even students? What about elders? Maybe people who are experiencing grief. Maybe people who are anticipating grief. So think about somebody whose spouse might have Alzheimer's, and that is a really changed relationship. You know that there's going to be an end to it, but it hasn't ended yet. Why can't we as congregations surround those individuals with people that can be a support system for them? Not just casually, but intentionally. And there are some congregations that are doing that. It's uncomfortable. It is uncomfortable to go up to somebody that you've gone to church with for decades and to say, hey, you might be experiencing grief. Even though you're not expressing it, let me take you out to lunch. Let me help you navigate this whole new situation. So I think that's really inspiring that it can work on a secular level, but for us, we really need to take advantage of that spirituality and those connections that we have to try to grow something new and exciting to support not only people in the community, but also people in our own congregations. Oh, I think we're not going to show it.
Okay, because we had another video,
but we're done.
We're done.
Close.
Yeah. I want to leave you with this quote about a movement called sacred activism. The theology is very different, but I'm not suggesting this that you join Andrew Harvey's movement, but I think he makes a point. A spirituality that is only private and self-absorbed, one devoid of an authentic political and social consciousness, does little to halt the suicidal juggernaut of history. On the other hand, an activism that is not purified by profound spiritual and psychological self-awareness and rooted in divine truth, wisdom, and compassion will only perpetuate the problem it is trying to solve, however righteous its intentions. When, however, the deepest and most grounded spiritual vision is married to a practical and political drive to transform all existing political, economic, and social institutions, a holy force, the power of wisdom and love in action is born. I think that's what you're doing.
So we'd like to open it up to you and to find out what kinds of things that you might define as spiritual activism you are doing in your congregations or in your regions.
And we're professors, so we know people to call on if nobody talks.
You have something? Yeah, right. Maybe, I don't know if you want to.
Are there mics for
here
people?
comes a mic. Yeah, that was our
Thank you. Is it on? Yeah. So I'm from First Presbyterian Church, Portland, Oregon, and we're a congregation that was large and is now much smaller. We also own a retreat center, and there's some question about how do we make good use of that ministry. And so we were having kind of a falling apart Sunday school program talking about faith formation. And the new idea that came to us was to start a Presbyterian community of practice and invite 4 20-somethings to come live at this retreat center, serve at the downtown church, serve in some way in the city that they decide on once we've gathered them together so that they feel spirit-led in doing this. It'll be something that builds a resume for a young person to have done something like this, and hopefully serve in a way that honors the resources that we have and the people that we are becoming in this new Presbyterian world.
Tell me about the student loan thing.
Oh, and I just found out at this conference that the PCUSA has student loan repayment help. Where's Mel? Shout out to Mel. She's not in here right now. She may be at her booth. But they can get $250 a month to help pay their student loans off so they can afford to do this cool thing. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you.
I'm Heidi Vardaman from Minneapolis. I became the designated pastor of a church that used to be about 300 and now it's down to 78. But the quilters remained. The ladies come in on 9 o'clock on Tuesday mornings and they quilt. And they traditionally gave a quilt to every one of the high school students, of their high school students that graduated. This year was the last high school student ever. And so what the ladies did is that a young man from the Cameroon who moved to the Twin Cities as a refugee was a Presbyterian, and he found his way to our church. And this is his first winter in Minnesota. And they gave him a quilt. And then he brought some other friends who are new to Minnesota. And they continue to give, they have given out 4 quilts.
I'm Carol Mason from Maryland Presbyterian here in Baltimore. Our congregation had one of the older women whose first her son-in-law had cancer and died, and then her daughter was in an accident and died, and there were 2 grandchildren left, and our congregation went to the parents' home and found out that they were hoarders. We spent days and days and days with 2 dumpsters, 3 yard sales, clearing out their house for those boys so they could go and live with their grandmother. And then eventually they were adopted by a couple in the congregation.
Goodness.
Shannon White, I'm the pastor at Wilton Presbyterian Church in Connecticut. And one of the things we've done, we're kind of a white suburban community, but we do have a lot of people who have alcoholism. And so we are working on reaching out, and we've increased the number of AA meetings. My first sermon at the church was to tell people that I'm in recovery myself. And people started coming to me saying, I drink too much, and I'm like, let's go. And we're invested in communities around us. So last week, a group of our women went to a women's rehab and sat with them, baked bread and did collaging. We've had men come in from a local rehab, and the men cooked breakfast. So we're trying just to, create a culture of welcome around issues of recovery.
And that's an important point when you're doing this work. Taking care of yourself and dealing with your own pain is important, and we lapse into thinking that affluent white people don't have pain.
Right. Absolutely.
Is Michael from Knox here? Okay.
Good afternoon. I'm Therese Taylor Stinson from National Capital Presbytery, and we actually have a Presbytery-wide activity going on. This will be our 3rd year of the Racial Awareness Festival that we hold at Westminster Presbyterian Church in Southwest DC. We invite the community in. It's free to the community, free lunch. We have 2 emotional emancipation circles, and we've reached into Baltimore, and we've brought some Baltimore people over who help us to have emotional emancipation circles, and also white caucuses to talk about race. We have children that come in from Baltimore, and children in the schools in the neighborhood that come in and have an opportunity to interact with other children and talk about race. And this will be our 3rd year doing it.
Do you all know what emotional emancipation is? Could you explain?
So emotional emancipation circles are for people in the African diaspora to come together and to talk about racial issues and their experiences, and go back and even talk about history into current events to help them become emotionally free from the devaluing of Black lives and the historical trauma that has happened because of race.
How much more time do we have?
I think we've got
5
5
okay.
minutes. Was there somebody from,
My name's Kim Pretty. I'm in Sedgefield Presbyterian Church, and we have gotten to know our immigrant neighbors through a stranger to neighbor gathering where we asked folks from our community to sit with church folks, and dinners have occurred outside after this event. We also hosted our first Faith ID drive where we gave over 90 ID drives to those in our community who may not have other forms of IDs that will allow them to get children out of school and do certain things. So we've had continued conversations. We've had police there. We've had young people talk about how they want to go to college and get, and they need advocate work from our church to help them get in-state tuition. And so we've developed relationships with those that we thought were strangers, but they are our neighbors.
Good morning. My name is Prezavia Prelo. My previous call, which is ending in a few weeks, was pastoring a small African-American rural Presbyterian church. And so when we have been listening and viewing the movement afar in cities like Baltimore and Charlotte and all over the nation, the question becomes, how are these challenges that we are experiencing across the nation relevant to a rural context? Mm-hmm. And what I've learned from this thriving African-American congregation in rural South Carolina that has a history of about 150 years is that there's nothing new under the sun. And what I want to lift up as one word that is very important is the word of reclaiming our connection. And what has been very important to our experiences of engaging the community is really coming together. Most of the most of the rural churches in that community had previously been disconnected. And when we think about the larger history of the civil rights movement, for many reasons, many of our churches feel very disconnected from the local realities in which we live. And so in some ways, we're thinking about how can we change the dynamics. Well, what I have learned from the rural churches in South Carolina is that most of them pool their resources together. There's an organization called PK, Presbyterians Concerned for African American Youth. The organization has been around for about 30 years, but single-handedly, they have addressed what it means to nurture young people who are African American, growing up in rural contexts, and through this organization, they've been able to pool resources. And so when we hear stories coming out of Winsboro, South Carolina, about what is happening in Baltimore, the question becomes, well, is that our reality? It may not be the specific reality, but we're looking at entrenched segregation, we're looking at poverty, we're looking at many different challenges. And so I just wanted to lift up that in many ways, we have done many of the work before, but we need to think about how our congregations can come together and do similar work that was very active in the civil rights movement during the Depression, but it seems that many of our churches are disconnected from the realities right outside of our door. And so when we come to conferences, we hear about what is happening and being done in other cities, but we also forget that we have similar issues right outside of our door.
I want to make sure. Okay, no hands on this side.
Hi everyone, I'm Mel Tubb. Thank Lauren for mentioning me earlier. My job is to help with student loans. Student loans is become a huge justice issue in our country. And our job and my job is to help people be able to serve in contexts in which they can feel a sense of being able to serve without having to have student loans as a barrier. So if you have a Presbyterian organization and want to have an intern or a resident or anything and have somebody that can come in and has student loans that would not allow them to do that, come talk to me. I can help you. We can go through it. I do consultations. If you just want to cry and talk about how terrible your student loans are, I can help. I am with you. Yes, so thanks. Thanks, Lauren.
I've been told that we are at time.
There's one.
So
we
one
have
more comment. One more comment.
She's been standing there very patiently.
One more comment. You get the final word.
Yeah, no pressure. So I serve Serious Juju Skateboard Ministry, and I'm not going to talk about that today, but it's awesome. But this last week, our Browning friends, the Blackfeet tribe in northwest Montana, are in a flood of snow, and they haven't been able to leave their homes since like January 9th, and they're under 70 inches of snow, and now with winds that are picking up even today, it's like 40, 50 mile an hour winds. So you actually try to like move snow off a street, you know, like the only highway, it just covers. And our elder in our church, Tom, who got us connected with Juju in the first place, said, this is our Hurricane Katrina moment. You know, and it's like, it is, and it's not being covered anywhere in any national news that I've heard of because we don't pretend to care about Native Americans anymore. So this last week, the Methodists have been working really strong. They have some connections there that we don't really have at all, so that's good. And they said what they need is to literally shovel people out of their homes because they haven't gotten dialysis or food or like anything. So this last week, like Rotarians and some Juju people and like some other random people have gotten together and they got like a semi-load full of diapers, babies' diapers. And they went over the Rocky Mountains and over the Continental Divide into Browning on the one street that was kind of open. And they're being housed in a warehouse that used to house blankets full of smallpox because that's what white people did. Right. So we have to be really cautious about the gifts we give and how we give because the history is right there staring us in front of the face. If we come into your emergency, are we creating more of one? And then I think they are chopping up as we speak 6 loads of wood from semi-trucks to get wood out to heat these homes, which is the only way these people are surviving. So pray for them, and it's incredible.
Yeah, thanks.
Well, I'd just like to end on a positive note. The crime
was a positive
statistics, the crime statistics for Baltimore for this year are in, and our mayor would like you to know that across the board, all crime statistics are down, and we actually had a grassroots ceasefire. And it didn't work the first time, it didn't work the second time, but the third time we went 12 days recently with no murders in Baltimore City. So.
Thank you, Dr. Parks, Dr. Nix. Thank you so much for your testimony.